Hello, everybody. Welcome to our read-along live show discussion for The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. My name is Alex. I am from the channel Frank Fiction, and I primarily focus on like science fiction and horror on my channel. But I have three lovely ladies here that have their own channels, and they're going to talk about what they discuss. So I will start with you, Nicole. Go ahead.
Sure. Hi. Yeah, my name's Nicole. My channel is Noteworthy Fiction, and I discuss a variety of books, but I feel like I've become more well known for the classics I read and the really large books that I read.
You certainly were the catalyst for starting this discussion, Nicole. So this is awesome. Alex, you want to go ahead?
Yes, I'm Alex from Alex Black Reads. I also read a variety of things, but I read a lot of nonfiction and realistic fiction on my channel. So you can usually join me over there for that.
Awesome. Thank you. And Jessica.
Hi, my name is Jessica. I'm from the channel This Kiwi, and I read pretty much anything. I'm very new to classics, but I read pretty much anything. I think my go-to genre is fantasy, but I also like literary fiction, contemporary fiction, and that kind of stuff. I want to get into sci-fi.
I'm always happy to have help with those recommendations.
Horror as well. So yeah, I'll be working on that this year.
Awesome. Perfect. Thank you. And Jessica also was very gracious enough to volunteer to give a brief little description of The Picture of Dorian Gray, because we're starting out with kind of like a short non-spoiler section for any of those who haven't read the book. So Jessica, do you want to give that?
Yeah. So the crux of the book really is about a man who is incredibly beautiful on the outside, and he becomes obsessed with beauty and he wants to keep it, and so he goes about doing stuff in order to keep that beauty, and yeah, the relationships and things that he either makes or destroys along the way is also explored.
That was awesome. Thank you. And just as like some initial like spoiler-free thoughts, I also should probably say, go ahead and tell us in the chat, for those of you who are here, whether you read The Picture of Dorian Gray or not. What is like a fun icon we could use for like if you read it? So we have like just put a man, put like a man emoji in the chat if you have read it, and do like a black heart if you haven't, because it's totally okay if you joined this discussion and you haven't read it prior. We're happy to have everybody here. But just for like our initial non-spoiler thoughts of the book, what all did you think of it? And also, what did you rate the book?
Ooh.
Whoever wants to go first. Since I'm that question asker, I will go last for all of these.
Because I feel like, based on what I saw on Storygraph, I think maybe I rated it the highest. I rated it a 4-star. And it is absolutely not because of the writing. From a writing perspective, it's like a 2-star. But from a psychological and layered perspective, it was like a 4.5, 5-star, and so I went to a 4-star because of that, because it's a book that really, really made me think, and it's a book that I am still thinking about. I mean, I was watching videos on some of the things that I discussed in an email to you, Alex. I was watching a video on it just this morning. So yeah, I think it's a book that will stay with me, and I think it's a book that if I decide to reread it, I may have to swallow my pride and actually annotate. So yeah, for that reason, I gave it a 4-star.
Okay. Alex.
Well, I'll go ahead. I gave it a 3-star, though I have to say I kind of had similar areas where I was torn about it, like Jessica. So I did decide this year not to do half stars. Otherwise, it would have probably been closer to 4 for me, like a 3.75 or something like that. I basically feel like I could see why this book is so well appreciated as a classic, and especially as a book that is studied. But personally, for me, it was just okay. So that's how it ended up at a 3, since I can't give it partial credit.
So I just finished it like 30 minutes ago.
On it. I love it.
I did finish it. I gave it 2 stars.
Okay.
Not been my favorite classic. Not without its redeemable qualities. I think there were some really beautiful lines in it, and I think some very interesting ideas. But I did struggle a lot with his writing and the storytelling and the treatment of women,
which we will get
into. Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there were plenty of things that like I did enjoy, but it just, yeah, it was kind of a rough one for me, and I was really glad it was only like 150 pages.
I would have to agree with a lot of what you said, Alex, and well, really everybody, because there were like parts of this that were really good for me and parts of it that just kind of started going downhill. So I gave it 3 stars overall. In the beginning, I was hooked. I was like, this is great. I'm really enjoying this. I think it's enthralling. The longer that the book went on for me, the less and less I liked it. And that probably is partially for me because I don't really enjoy books where the characters are not likable people. I don't know if other people deal with that, but you know, like when the characters aren't likable, I have a hard time rooting for them. And in this case, you're not really supposed to root for the main character because he's kind of a horrible person. And also just from the horror perspective, I do appreciate it for what it did at the time. Definitely. Like, because I recognize that this is, of course, very different horror than like modern horror that I read now. But what's so funny about that is what scared people about the Picture of Dorian Gray when this was written is like so low level like horror now. And I guess that's just because I've read so many things now that by comparison are like grotesque, right? And so that's why this was just kind of like a middle of the road book for me. It wasn't great, it wasn't terrible. I just thought it was okay, and I probably wouldn't reread it again. So that's why I gave it 3 stars. So we are going to head into spoiler territory now for any of you who did not read the book. So just be warned.
Before we get to that, can we actually go to the comments real quickly?
Yeah, please. Absolutely.
And just to let everybody know who's watching, the way we're going to do the comments is we are going to try and keep in real time with the comments. And so I'm the comment girl, so I'm representing everybody in the comments. So I will skip some of the hellos just because it will be too much to say hello to everyone. But hello to all of you who are there, and thanks for coming again. But do make sure that as we discuss each of these things that you also share your thoughts. So we did get a whole bunch of hellos from people that we're regularly seeing, and everybody did figure out how to put a little man in. So we've got some men in the comments. Somebody did, Dee Dee did a mirror with a guy.
Oh, I didn't realize that was one. That's good.
Yep. So there is that one. And then we did start getting some ratings. So Alicia said that she gave this a 4-star. So there are some people in the 4-star camp with you, Jessica. Alex, stay-at-home reader, gave it a 3-star. I'm just realizing I can't click on the comments, but I will say
you can't. Okay, I will try to do that as you go through. I didn't realize that. Okay.
Yeah, I didn't either. Yeah. Kay gave it a 5-star. So I definitely want to hear about that at some point. Dee Dee gave it a 4-star, so there were quite a few 4 stars. And then Heidi said that she remembers liking it and read Jekyll and Hyde too, so they blur together. But she remembers Dorian Gray being more from the Penny Dreadful book, which is interesting. So I have not read a Penny Dreadful. And Miss Starbuck said it was a 3 for her. So, and then I think that's all the ratings that I see thus far. And while you move on, I will start reading the other comments.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. I think Emily
Okay.
said 2-star for the same reasons that Alex mentioned, and then Heather 2 for me due to pretentiousness of the writing. I gotta love that. Oh, so yes. Going into our first like spoiler question, meeting Lord Henry could be considered the inciting incident for Dorian, leading him down this dark path that he has decided to take. Do you believe that Dorian had something evil in him to begin with, or do you think that Lord Henry kind of put the seed in his mind and brought that out of him?
I'll go last for this because I have like a whole theory.
Okay.
I think I would say that because I mean, he's a character in a book, right? So there's that we have to keep in mind. But I think based on the author, I would say that he would have made Dorian a complex character either way. So I don't feel like Oscar Wilde would have made a character that would have been completely pure or completely evil, because I would say I don't feel like Dorian at the end of the book in some ways was completely immoral or without a conscience. He definitely wasn't the most moral person, but so that's me. I think that Henry brought out a lot more of what there always was the potential of.
Okay. I love that, Alex.
I also think at the beginning, Dorian had very much a thoughtlessness about him. Like, not just that he was a blank slate, but he put basically zero thought into any aspect of his life or like life in general. And I think that also has that's kind of like a negative reflection on his character. Whereas like as soon as he started like having thoughts and like putting effort into these things, it's like it became very negative, but I think it was always that's who he was. He just never like bothered to think about anything prior to that.
I do agree a lot with that. I think that there was always the potential that he could develop that way, because I think if he had met somebody else who wasn't Lord Henry, who said something in a similar vein or maybe down a different path, that Dorian was impressionable enough because he's so young. He was impressionable enough that he could have probably been led one way or the other. I just view him as like he's a teenager, right? And teenagers like can be manipulated in all sorts of ways. I hate to say that, but it's true because their brains aren't fully developed. And so had he not spoken to Lord Henry, would he maybe have gone as far down the path of debauchery as he did? Maybe not, but he might have done some degree of it. What I found interesting was by the end of the book how much further he went than Lord Henry himself, because Lord Henry starts out as being like this really kind of bad influence, and then Dorian takes it so many steps past even what he would do. And I thought that that was a really interesting part about his character, and it said a lot about Dorian as well.
So maybe my theory doesn't really kind of come into it just yet, but for me, there is basis to think that he was, first of all, I think Dorian was absolutely in the beginning manipulated and used by Lord Henry. I've got to remember not to call him Lord Pratt. Yeah, I think he was absolutely the inciting incident, but at the same time, I think because of Dorian's childhood, I think there was a little grain of something there, like he wasn't loved by his father. I think I remember his father saying like he was selfish or self-absorbed or something like that. And then I completely agree with you, Alex, down here with there was at the beginning there was a thoughtlessness to Dorian. He didn't really care about Betty at all, and in my opinion he was quite innocent. And then the moment that Henry stepped into the picture, everything changed. So to answer the question, do I think Lord Henry was the inciting influence? Yes, absolutely. I think he was.
Yeah, there's been quite a few people who have commented with their thoughts on it.
Actually,
Heidi,
what Kay is just saying, sorry, I just saw Kay's comment, is absolutely on the same veins of what I'm thinking.
yeah, if you want to, yep, there's Kay's comment. So,
right down the very bottom.
Yep, further
It
down.
says,
Oh, yeah.
yeah, there we go.
This one. Yeah, my apologies, everybody. We thought everybody would be able to interact with the comments, so I was like so focused on the questions. My apologies. Yeah, got a lot of
yes, mental health crisis, and that's kind of, as I've been reading the book, that is how I started looking at it, and I think that really changed my perspective of the book going forward, especially as Dorian got worse and worse and worse, and then really dived into that spiral. Yeah.
So what all did you think for each of you? How did your opinion of Lord Henry change over the course of the novel? And for those of you in the comments, let us know as well. And I'll start. I'll just kind of like rotate them up as they come up. How about that? So that way we don't miss any. But yeah, what did you all think of him at the beginning versus at the end?
My opinion didn't change. I still think he's a prat.
of Lord Henry?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Gosh, I found myself more annoyed with him as the book went on, but I don't think it was actually his character himself. I think it was more how he was written. I think at the beginning of the book, he was actually a more interesting character. Not one that I liked. Well, that's not totally true. And unlike you, Alex, in some ways, I can like a not likable character.
Okay.
So at the beginning of the book, I did not think he was a good character, but he kept making me laugh because I was like, you're so messed up. And I just could see the irritating humor in him. Because there was a part of him that was witty, but just hateful and with no good for anyone. So, but that it doesn't personally bother me. Like, I was like, yes, you are the character that I love to hate. Okay, got it. But as the book went on, he kept getting these like one-liners and he became like one-line Henry. And it was like, even when he spoke a paragraph, it was still full of one-liners. And I think at one point on Storygraph, I was like, we could make a calendar out of his quotes. That like a page-a-day calendar where it's just like all the stupid things that Henry says. And that to me was probably one of the biggest turnoffs in the writing. Was I was like, can this guy have a full, complete paragraph of thought instead of just one like blurb at a time? So I feel like he changed, but the writing of him changed. So
that is fair. I would agree that he was definitely more interesting in the beginning, and I think that's partially why I liked him so much. Or at least I should say I didn't like him. I liked the story a lot more at the beginning, and why I found it so interesting. I didn't really like any of the characters except for maybe Sybil, which we'll get into. And Basil. Basil was fine too, but everybody else I was like, you're all trash. I don't like you. You're all trash people. But I found it like Henry was almost written as kind of a joke to me by the end, because he proved that, originally it was supposed to be oh, well, Dorian, the reason you like me so much is because you're too much of a coward to go with your baser instincts. And then what happens? Well, Dorian flies off the rails, and Lord Henry doesn't even know about all the things that Dorian has done. And he still thinks that I would argue Lord Henry thinks he's probably like the most debaucherous of all of his friends. Like, he just thinks that he has such great ideas that nobody else is even willing to entertain until they listen to him monologue at a dinner party for the 5th time. And that was probably the thing that that grated on me is the fact that by the end, I realized that he wasn't really that unique. And a lot of the ideas that he had either were awful about women or they didn't make a damn lick of sense. Like he was just a very contradicting, self-contradicting person. And you could kind of see that with the people in his life being like, oh, you don't really believe even the things that you say. And
Right.
by the time that we got to the end, I was like, I'm ready for this to be over. I don't want to hear from Lord Henry anymore.
Yeah. What was it
And
his cousin called him? Didn't she call him like Prince Paradox or something like
Yes.
that?
Yes. That was exactly it.
I do just want to address that previous comment about who talks like that from Heather. I haven't read a lot of classics, but I felt like that from the time that it was written, I felt like it was written realistically. But I don't know anybody, Nicole or anybody else who reads a lot of classics, do you guys think that it was written realistic for the time, or what do you reckon?
No, I feel like Oscar Wilde for sure. Like I could tell the difference between his writing and other literature written at the same time. Like he has a very strong voice. And actually what really stood out to me was his freaking Lord Henry for me was a trash philosopher. Yeah, when he even hung out with him. I agree, Zach. I'm with you on that one. But from okay, and I think this really speaks to Oscar Wilde. There were times where I felt like the book read like a play and where I was waiting for like stage directions. And given that Oscar Wilde is really known for his plays as well and wrote quite a few, I would say he maybe wrote similar to other playwriters at the time. But that was one of the first things that stood out to me when I read the book was I was like, oh, this is a very different writing style. This is a very different voice. And I don't know if you would feel the same way, Alex. I know you've read a decent number of classics.
Not me, Alex.
not me.
You, Alex.
I read Wuthering Heights. That was it.
Nicole, you're a
Okay.
resident classic expert, like
Yeah.
of all of us.
I don't know about that, but I studied 100 years earlier than this time period, but I know there are other people in the comments who have read classics, so maybe some other people. Yes,
I actually agree with the sentiment that there were parts of it that really read like a play.
I agree.
There were whole pages that was just dialogue, and I was like, yeah, this is Oscar Wilde just going back to what he knows. And there were times where I could actually see it playing out on a stage. So
It was like alternating between just pages of dialogue and then paragraphs of purple prose, and there was nothing in between.
Yeah. What did you all think of that one chapter that this isn't one of our questions that just popped in my head. What did you all think of that one chapter that was basically just Dorian talking about his interests and it had no purpose whatsoever? That chapter killed me. I think that was at that point in the book I started being like, I need this to end. Like I need to get to the end of the book now if this is going to be what the story is like.
chapter 11.
Chapter 11.
Yeah, chapter 11. It was almost exactly halfway through. I remember that because there are 20 chapters.
Chapter 11 was his mental breakdown. Yeah.
I got through that real quick.
Yeah.
I have mixed feelings about chapter 11. I did not like it, but I understood the point. I did think it actually served a point in the book. I just don't think it served that point well.
Yeah.
I felt like the point of that chapter for me was one to serve as a transition of time. Like it was the chapter that served the time gap and kind of moved time forward, which something needed to since it wasn't going to physically be Dorian. But Heather, tell us how you really felt about it. But that said, I do think that it was important that put in there some way to indicate that time was changing. And I remember in my sprints, somebody said that in a movie, that chapter would have been served well by a montage.
Yes.
And it again makes me think like this chapter would work out better in a play, like visually, than it would written. I think there's just so many other ways that he could do it, and the way that he did it, I think slowed the pace of the book down and just made it dull as bricks. But I don't know how familiar any of you are with the Bible, but someone at one point said if this was one of the books in the Bible, it would be the book of Numbers. Yes, 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 Dee Dee, yes. And just list after list. And here's what was inside this chest. No. So, yes.
Yes, I agree with that completely. And the next question that I had, sorry if I had like stuck to the the list here, was how did your view of Dorian change? So we talked about Lord Henry, but what about Dorian?
Okay. So my view of Dorian, at first I thought he was just spoiled and the whole like aristocratic, things like that. And then he really, it kind of took that down. And actually that's when the book picked up. I preface this by saying I'm not an awful person. But the only time I really enjoyed the book was when he plummeted. And going back to that chapter 11 thing, I actually think, based on what I think of Dorian, that the chapter was necessary, although I do still think that it needed to be cut down to like 2 chapters at the most. And so kind of as the book went along, I could see some certain things about Dorian, and I'm not a psychologist. Absolutely no way am I a psychologist, so I am not qualified to make this diagnosis, but I saw massive narcissistic tendencies. And so my whole theory about Dorian is that he's a narcissist.
And they do refer to Narcissus in the book too.
Yeah.
Especially with the portrait, after he was like looking at his own beauty and like in awe of his own beauty. So I definitely think there is something to say for that, for
but
sure.
from a mental health perspective, I feel like narcissism is pointed out throughout the book. So, yeah.
I think in addition to narcissism, I think you also see a lot of like hedonism, just that pleasure for pleasure's sake, and the more pleasure, the better the pleasure, and the, sugar on top of sugar kind of thing. I feel like, so I'm of two minds in a lot of ways, obviously, right? Like as the book goes on, you just don't like Dorian. But in other ways, as just a character in this book, I liked him more and more as the book went on, because I thought he started out as a very like one-dimensional, irritating character in the book. Like he felt like a child to me at the beginning of the book, which I thought was interesting. Like he didn't feel like he was in his teens. He felt like he was like a spoiled 3-year-old. And then over the course of the book, he became a darker character, yes, but significantly more complex. Like there was a point where he was just being bad for bad's sake. But like in those first couple of chapters after chapter 11, but by the last 2 chapters of the book or so, he was really struggling with things. Like he wanted to not be affected by anything, but certainly after the major couple of deaths in the book, he was affected, despite what he wanted to say that the picture was taking it all. So so in that sense, I liked him as a character, though I liked nothing he did.
What about you, Alex?
I think he was, for like the first half of the book, he felt so one note, because he was just such a shallow, vapid person who seemed almost like he was in search of a personality for himself, and like he was just gravitating towards like the first person who gave him some sort of sense of like purpose and being in the world, which was Harry, whatever his name was. And then it was only in like the second half that you could see he started to actually like reflect on his life. And like, not that he was making good decisions, but it seemed like that was when he started to actually make decisions for himself, which was when it did become like much more interesting to me.
I definitely think the turning point for Dorian was the first moment he fell in love, or so supposedly to him, he fell in love. And we see a lot about like what he valued in another person and the reason why he decided to love Sybil and how like quickly that could fade for him. And that was up until that point, I didn't really think he had done anything. Like, I would agree, it wasn't interesting. Like, he was a pretty flat character. He hadn't really had like any amount of development. We were kind of just waiting around to see what he would do. But we knew based off of like foreshadowing and Basil's response to Lord Henry and being like, I don't want you to meet my friend Dorian, you'll spoil him, that like something was going to happen. We knew that something about his personality was going to change from the sweet, innocent, teenager, or seemingly innocent teenager. And I would definitely say that yes, the tragedies that he kind of incited in other people's lives made him more interesting, but of course that also made him more despicable too. And I hate to say this, and again, I think this goes back to like the difference between horror then and horror now. I wish we had gotten more descriptions of the things that he actually did. Like, once he goes down this lane and he starts to become the Starker character, we kind of just get hints as to like, oh, well, he was talking to all these women and now they're spoiled in society and no like self-respecting man would want to marry them, or this person is in gambling debt, or this person's on drugs now because of like hanging out with Dorian. It's like, I wish that we had just heard more, gotten more details about those people, kind of than just like an over-the-shoulder camera. I don't know if anybody else felt that way though.
Yeah, I felt the same way from a writing perspective. It was really frustrating because it was just like, oh, he's now all of a sudden got this terrible reputation. And we're just supposed to accept that. But at the same time, creatively, like, and I think this has come up in Storygraph about the creative license of Oscar Wilde. I think it was a choice on his part, like pretty much to show that Dorian just didn't care.
Do you
Yeah,
think?
I mean, I think Dorian.
Oh. Go ahead, Nicole. Sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think Dorian was partially not focused on those things, but I think it was also a part of the time period. I mean, Oscar Wilde struggled to get the book published as it is, and then got into massive amounts of trouble for what he did put in. And that was the edited and censored version of what he wrote. So I don't know that even if he wanted to, that he could have put in more than what he did. And I mean, that said, given that he goes and visits basically an opium den in the middle of the book, is already pretty wild for that time period. But it does make it, I think, tough as readers in the future who are used to seeing a lot more on-page, graphic violence or whatever, to not get more of that in the book. I can definitely see that being a struggle.
It was so scandalous at the time. Yeah, I guess we are very desensitized to a lot of things now. I mean, we had Game of Thrones, just freely available for people to watch, so by comparison, yes, I that makes perfect sense that this would be like scandalizing for London society and like polite people at the time. I do wonder about Kay's question here. Are there any good retellings of Dorian Gray with more? Like, do you all know of like movies or TV adaptations or anything? Because I've never seen anything.
Great question. I know Penny Dreadful had a
Okay.
I feel like of all the depictions I've seen of Dorian Gray, I think Penny Dreadful did it the best. Where like you actually see some of those sins and how he kind of gets rid of them because of that painting. But I mean, I've also seen a depiction of him. The first time I ever met Dorian Gray was through The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, which is a movie. It's an old movie. It's got Sean Connery in it. And Dorian was played by Stuart Townsend. And I think that was probably one of the best depictions of like the self-absorbed, selfish kind of that self-absorbedness that Dorian has. But yeah, overall I think Penny Dreadful, that 2009. Are you talking about 2009 Dorian Gray?
Yeah, the
Had Colin Firth,
2009.
if I recall. Wasn't that the one with
Yeah.
Colin Firth? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, he's Lord Henry.
Oh my God, no. He's so
I
sweet,
know.
though.
Like, what? No, I can picture it. But from what I have heard, the 2009 is supposed to be the creepiest, sort of most modern, I guess, feeling rendition. Though I have also heard that it leans into the horror side of it. And it could be questioned, is that just because that's more allowed now, or was, how that decision got made? But I have heard that the 2009, some people feel like, is actually way scarier than the book itself. So
I need to see that then.
Yeah, that's a great comment. Homework, the movie. You guys can. I don't know about you guys in the States, but in New Zealand, I have to like rent it off YouTube. So I might do that a bit later. But I am interested to know if, like, we've been talking about movies here as movie depictions. I am interested to know if anybody has read any books as a retelling or that have Dorian Gray in them. Apart from, obviously, the Picture of Dorian Gray. Wait, what? Oh, in the movie?
I'm very curious about that now too. Like, how graphic is this movie?
And no, I've heard it's bad.
Oh, see, Dee Dee says she fell asleep. So we got one person who wants to throw up and one person who's snoring. So, debatable where that leaves the movie. Okay, it says, Nicole, you have homework. I definitely feel like I have homework. I need to see that.
I think, yeah.
No way.
I think I need to go away and watch it.
Well, let me ask you all this. Other than narcissism, which is kind of like the main thing that's pointed to in the book, like where Narcissus is referenced, Jessica, you were wanting to talk about like any other maybe mental illnesses or did you see anything else with your psychology background in him or any of the other characters?
I mean, for a while there, I thought that maybe there could have been tendencies of him being a psychopath, but then reading on, he actually does have feeling, or like even a sociopath, but he does have feeling. Like when the murder of Basil happened, or even like before he murdered Basil, there was the quick clips of him being really scared to lose him. And then once he'd lost him, he was like really scared that he was going to get found out. And then, there wasn't a lot of feeling in regards to Alan's death, which was just glossed over in like a single sentence. But then when it came to, was it Jim was Sybil's brother? Like the absolute fear of Jim and the fear of was it death? He did say exactly what he was scared of at that point. But then the elation knowing that Jim had accidentally got shot. So he does have feeling. And like I said, I'm not a psychologist, so yeah, I'm not sure. There is definitely mental illness there.
Yeah, it would be interesting to know. I mean, like it is talked about at the beginning of the book. Like Henry does say, like, I want to psychologically study Dorian. So there is a sense in which he is thinking about like the psychology of it. At the same time, psychology was in a very different place then than it is now. So there is also a question of how much did he write was intentionally part of that psychology and what did he mean by that. But I thought Heather, quite a ways back, made a really interesting point about the narcissism, which is even though narcissism and narcissist comes up frequently in the book itself, one of the traits of narcissism that Dorian doesn't have, which is that he is just the main influencer on others. In so much that Dorian himself is actually influenced very heavily, even as he goes along throughout the book. And that is something that's very unusual for Narcissist, but would hold up with him just being narcissistic, but not necessarily the psychological term of it as it's used today.
Yeah, so there is one thing that I want to bring up. There's a doctor on YouTube, Dr. Romani, and I've watched a couple of her videos, and she has stated that people with narcissistic personality disorder, yes, they're narcissists, but people who have narcissistic tendencies aren't necessarily diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder. It's only when they seek treatment and they realize that their behaviors and their personality is actually a problem for people surrounding them, that's when they go through that diagnosis. And if you guys are okay with it, I actually want to link to a video that I was watching this morning from this Dr. Romani, and it's about how narcissists are actually made in the first place, like what kind of brings on those tendencies.
Yeah, go for it.
Cool.
Alex, did you have any other thoughts about that question? And that's okay if the answer is no.
Not really on the psychology bit, no.
Okay. I would say my last probably comment about that would be that for me, it seemed like Dorian was always coming from the perspective of like self-preservation. Like any emotion that he seemed to have wasn't really for concern about other people. It was more so concern about himself. Like the idea that there could be an inquest into him being responsible for, Sybil, or when Basil, he murdered Basil, and he's like, well, now I got to get this guy and I got to blackmail him to hide this body for me because he won't do it on his own, so I'm going to blackmail him to do it. And that's why it's like he at all of those points, it doesn't really care about the people he's actually hurt. He's only worried about himself. At least that's the way that I viewed it. I didn't think that he really had any emotion, even when it came to somebody like planning to murder him. Of course he's scared because he's thinking he's going to be murdered. But when the murderer James dies, he's like, oh, thank God for that. I don't even feel bad for this guy whose sister he sorely missed, and that's why he came after me. He's just like, oh, thank goodness he's dead. And that was kind of the way.
He had a few moments. I think he had a few moments where because I kept expecting his conscience to completely disappear, but I felt like it never truly did. I feel like with the whole incident with Basil, I think that was probably the biggest moment where I felt like you finally saw him continue to go back and forth, because he did keep having those moments where he was like, oh my gosh, I feel really bad about this and what should I be doing? And then he'd kind of let it go. So I did feel like he kept doing that. And even with with the guy he blackmailed. It even kept talking about how he kept looking at him and being like, wow, I feel really bad for you. But it was like none of that kept him from doing the things that he was doing. But he kept looking at him like, oh, I feel bad because I know I'm about to blackmail you. And you poor man. But I'm going to do it anyway.
You poor
I'm going to
bastard.
make me feel bad about it.
Okay, well, the next question that I have, funny enough, is were there any characters that you found sympathetic and why?
Any characters that we found sympathetic or that we were sympathetic towards?
Yes. Anybody. I do have a couple. I do have some that I feel bad for.
I mean,
the brother. That was about it.
Honestly, this may
James.
be like my weird way of thinking, but I felt sorry for Dorian. I think he was manipulated really badly, and I think that quite heavily impacted on his decisions, and then he just kind of got stuck in that cycle. And I think he got stuck in, and actually that's one thing that I haven't brought up. I think it became an addiction, with all these material grandiosities, and then all of that attention and that positive attention that he got. I think that became an addiction, and also being able to influence other people. So I actually felt sorry for Dorian.
And I know, Alex, you said you were sorry for James, Sybil's brother. Was that the only one you said you felt bad for?
Yeah, kind of. Honestly, everyone else was kind of awful in some way or other, and then James just kind of seemed like he was living his life and he knew some bad vibes were going down and kind of like could never really do anything, and then just got killed in a tragic accident that had nothing to do with anything.
I think I felt bad for actually quite a few characters. I had a lot of sympathy for. Like Sybil was one. She was like just such that like, innocent and, just over the moon's rose tinted glasses love. And and she's having like these amazing moments in her own life that are being totally destroyed by Dorian. I felt sympathetic towards Basil, maybe not quite as much as Sybil, even though I felt like they were both similarly deluded and obsessed with Dorian. But I mean, I definitely felt bad that he just got stabbed in the back of the neck. And then also the guy that he all the people really that Dorian was blackmailing and just leading into these horrible lives, because there was the guy that he ran into in the opium den, who was like, the fullness of how his life was destroyed was he was just now bombed out on opium. There was the doctor that he blackmailed, that then it's like, oh yeah, did you know that he offed himself? Moving on, let's keep going. There was the random servant who, like, at the very beginning of the book, he's very, very close to, and then he's like, yeah, no, I'm becoming paranoid, maybe because I'm doing opium. And, I think this guy's out to get me, and the next thing you know, he has a different servant. So even though this guy had worked for their house for like, forever, like he had grown up with this guy. So to me, it was like a never ending string of people who I just felt very sympathetic towards. And I think I was the opposite of Jessica. I think I felt bad for almost everyone except for Dorian and Lord Henry. Like,
I'm in pretty much the same boat as Nicole for that one. There were a lot of people that I felt bad for, and the sheer number of characters who committed suicide after being around Dorian, like, it was a lot of people. And that's not like, you can't attribute that to just like, oh, like one person was having personal struggles. Like he was out there ruining lives and he was doing it because he thought it was fun and he didn't see anything wrong with it. And so I did not find Dorian to be a sympathetic person because of how many people he just didn't care about. But the sheer number of lives he touched was a lot of them. So I would definitely say that I felt bad for many people. Sybil
Yeah.
was the first one I think I truly felt bad for, other than just like Basil's like friendship being hurt, you know. But yeah, Sybil, that hurt me a lot.
Yeah. Trigger warning
Okay,
for
you know,
suicide, by the
you
way.
just
Yeah,
what's
yeah.
that? I was gonna say, okay, you've said it multiple times, Alex. We've had this conversation. How does everybody say? You say Basil.
Basil.
I say basil.
Basil would be the plant, but when it's a
Yeah.
name, it would be basil.
Nope, it's basil for me both times.
Basil. Okay. Okay.
Everybody
See, I
basil.
say
What about you, Alex and Jessica?
I say
Is it-
Basil for the name, but and this is quite controversial in my household because we kind of use like New Zealand, British, English in like the spelling and speaking and stuff like that. But I say basil for the herb.
You also say herb.
Yeah, that's kind of ingrained in me. I can't really change that, but I do say basil for the herb, and then I say basil for the. But it's weird to say basil out loud. I've got to kind of stop and think about that personally.
And then both of your basils are different. The names, like the way you say it when it's a person's name. You guys both say it slightly differently. How do you say it, Alex?
I said it Basil because that's the British pronunciation. And well, I mean, he's Irish, not British, but like I assumed that was the intent. But yeah. Also,
Oscar Wilde,
a great
definitely
mouse
would have said it that
detective.
way.
Yeah, I have a friend in my personal life whose name is Basil, and the very first time that I met them, I was like, I said Basil. It's like that's wrong. And I immediately corrected it, and ever since then, every time I see it as a name now, I'm like, it's Basil. So I have to. That's why I do that because I did say Basil the first time. Yeah, but my next question here is, how does the social class of the characters affect our view of them and their problems?
Ooh.
And I'm fine going first on this one because I will say that we're around all of these characters that all they have to do all day long is dress in fancy clothing and go to the opera and dinner parties and gossip about one another and talk crap philosophy and talk about how much they feel that they should help the poor people, but they don't actually want to at the end of the day, you know, because there's so many other things that they could be doing with their time. And I think that, you know, Oscar Wilde was kind of showing a disdain for the higher class, at least at the time in London society, and kind of the way that they viewed things and viewed the rest of the world, especially other parts of London. And I think that that was meant to make them less sympathetic overall. So that was my take on that.
Yeah, I mean, there really is a lot of highlighting the grandeur of London society at the time, or at least the circle that Dorian was in. There was a lot of grandeur. There was a lot of gossiping and that kind of stuff. And I think being in that environment, that also plays a part and influences on, you know, one's thoughts and things like that. So Dorian also had that influence. But then in saying that, as he went along, he ended up being the influence. So yeah, I don't know. I don't really know how to answer that question.
Anybody else?
What was the question again?
It was, how does the social class of the characters affect our view of them and their problems?
Bunch of vapid rich people doing vapid rich people things.
Mhm. Yeah, I'd have to agree with that. Sounds like we had a very similar view for that one. So the next question that I had was Dorian's scandalous behavior shocks his peers, yet he remains welcome in social circles. You know, why? And what does Wilde suggest about polite London society?
I mean, I think he says pretty explicitly what he thinks about polite social society, which is, money can buy you anything.
Hmm.
Like, because I mean, what ends up happening? Like, as bad as Dorian gets, what happens is other people stop showing up to the parties.
Yeah, they leave when he gets there. They're like, I'm heading out.
Right. There's no point. There's clearly nothing that Dorian can do that's going to stop them from inviting him to these parties. So, like, even the knowledge that he possibly is why this girl killed herself and that he's made this other guy a drug addict, if I'm pretty sure if they knew he killed Basil, they'd be like, that's horrible. I'm not going to a dinner party with you at so and so's house. I'm not going to show up. But would Dorian still get an invite? Oh yeah, definitely.
And is that just because of how he looks? Like it's talked so much in the book about how like he is an attractive person and how only ugly people do ugly things. So it's like, yeah, you can hear about all these things that he did, but he's still beautiful, so we can invite him because who would really think he could do anything so bad? Right? That's kind of like the way it seemed to me. Does anybody agree or disagree with that?
Yeah, and I think Miss Virtue has a really good point. It's money and good looks will open doors.
Yeah, that's fair.
And I think that's very on point with that era. Yeah.
If you're really ugly, you need more money.
And then you could just buy more stuff.
Yeah. Buy more people's friendships.
But even then, people will still just pity you slightly.
Mm-hmm.
It's true.
She's so ugly. We could understand how that could happen.
Well, I mean, there were characters in the book, like women in particular, where the guys were like, "Oh, she's not good." The dowdy was how they were described, and I had to like look that word up when I got to it because I was like, "What do they mean by that?" It's like, "Oh, it means she doesn't dress well. She's making herself look bad, all frumpy." I guess is what we would say now. So yeah, there was a lot of characters like that too. This next one might be a little tricky I clicked on my question. Sorry. Was there any symbolism in the book that you found meaningful? And it's okay if you can't think of anything like right off the top of your head.
The one thing that comes to mind with me is the symbolism of, well, actually there's two things. Okay. One thing is, and there was a comment a way back about, Basil, who gives him all the love and affection, and then there's Henry that has the influence over all of the bad stuff. Like for me, that's symbolism in a massive way of the whole devil and angel on your shoulder kind of proverb or saying, where I think you've got both extremes of Basil as the angel kind of trying to keep Dorian in good conscience, and then you've got Henry who's a prat and has kind of highly influenced all the debauchery and the hedonism and stuff like that. And so there's that, and one thing kind of towards the end of it, and a lot of the times when Dorian was looking at his picture was, I think the picture painted a really good representation of Dorian's guilt. Like he may not have seemed guilty on the surface, but from a symbolic point of view, like there's the guilt of all of these people's, suicides and bad things that are happening to people because of Dorian, and that seems to be what's changing his picture. I think in a very, 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 very deep part of him, there is guilt there, and that's why the picture was changing.
Yeah, I mean the picture is definitely a reflection of what he should be feeling. But it is bearing deeply, and it's the reflection of his conscience. I mean, it could have also been, a mirror, where if the mirror just showed him what he truly looks like, quote unquote.
I don't think he felt so bad about the way that the picture looked, because we know in the book that he's like, oh, I revel in like always making it uglier. And I think really the only part of its ugliness that shocked him is when he initially recognizes that the picture is changing, and he's like, oh, why does my mouth look different and more mean, right? And then the point when he murders Basil and the picture has blood on it, like blood kind of like coming out of it in a way. But the rest of the time he seems to take joy in just how ugly he can make it, while in his life he gets to remain beautiful. So I really don't think that Dorian is guilty, like that he truly feels guilt. I think that he bounces things around in his mind, like he's kind of acting like he feels bad and like he'll change his ways, but not really.
I don't think he'd ever change his ways. I think part of his personality is he wouldn't change his ways. But I do think that the picture is really the representation of guilt and what maybe Dorian should be feeling for his actions.
Alex, did you have anything for this at all?
Just in terms of like the portrait, I think it horrified him to a degree to see how he could be ugly, like to see that ugly version of himself. But I think he lost touch with the reality of it because it became so separate from him. So like at the beginning, like he could see himself in the portrait. He could like see the subtle changes and how that would like look on his face. But then like by the middle, it's like so hideous and so like beyond what he could ever be that like it's like this cartoonish, outlandish thing that like he takes pride in destroying because he can.
I think that's a really good point, Alex. I think there was a lot of him that became more and more like disassociated with it as being part of him, because at the beginning, I mean, because he spends a lot of time looking at it, and so in some sense, you would feel like in a lot of ways, like he's spending a lot of time navel gazing, and like reflecting on like what his life is doing to himself. But he definitely seems to distance it from being himself more and more as he goes on.
I think the only other really main symbolism that I saw was when Lord Henry and Dorian go off to the theater together, like alone for the first time, and Basil isn't there. And then, of course, we recognize that like Dorian is going to become closer to Lord Henry and is going to start leaving Basil behind. And that is exactly what happens, to the point where like Dorian's last encounter with Basil, he like hadn't seen him in a really long time, and Basil's moving and Dorian didn't even know that. And he's going to go live in Paris for 6 months. I found that pretty good, like pretty well written overall. I also found it kind of ironic, at least I think irony would be a good way to put it, that Sybil's last name was Vane, Vane, but she is dating a vain, Vain man, and that ultimately was her demise. Like she herself was not a particularly vain person, and I was trying to figure out if there was any reason why he named her Sybil Vane, but I'm not sure, or if that was just like a name that he picked. So
I wonder if she was supposed to be more like weather vane,
the weather vane.
Trying to point him in the right direction.
That's fun. I like that idea.
I would have written that in a paper.
That's the symbolism, the true meaning. Yes. What was the part of the story that shocked you most versus what did you anticipate?
So I actually anticipated that. At first, I anticipated that Basil would be the one to destroy the painting. And then once he popped his clogs, I thought maybe it would be Henry. Obviously, there was always that threat of Jim, but I thought maybe Henry would have saw the painting and just been like, ugh! And set fire to it. But what really shocked me was that none of that happened. It was Dorian that destroyed his own painting. And yes, that was a choice, but it's definitely not a choice that I was expecting. And it's probably not my favorite choice either. I think it just would have been more actiony and more on what I was expecting the story to be if there had been that final conflict with somebody else.
I was kind of surprised by Dorian's complete success throughout the book at everything. His only downfall was himself and his own guilt and like his own conscience, really. And I think that it surprised me, and it was also very interesting commentary on society. Because like if he had been a psychopath and a complete narcissist and had like no feelings whatsoever, he could have kept going forever and been fine because he suffered no external consequences, like the occasional person who would shun him or whatever, but in general he could have kept going forever and been perfectly fine. And I just thought that was a really interesting direction.
Yeah, I think for me, I was just reading some of the comments, and I'm with Heather. I had no idea that Dorian was going to go to the point of murder. Despite the fact that I feel like it's kind of foreshadowed, it's kind of building up to that. But somehow, like, even in the moment, even when he's like walking across the room to go and get the knife that he sees, I was still totally shocked by that moment. And I think it was one because I was surprised that he actually did go and kill Basil. Sorry, I can't.
You're fine. It's fine.
He's gonna
It's
be
just a
Basil.
name. It's okay.
But then I think in addition to that, I used to argue with my best friend in middle school about this, and she was British, and I was like, I'm never calling it anything other than Basil. But I think the other thing that really threw me about it was I was expecting there to be some sort of fight, some sort of resistance, some sort of like stronger moment where they were going back and forth. So I think what ultimately surprised me about that moment was just how, like, as soon as he decided to walk across the room, he had already decided he was going, and it was like, grab the knife, turn around, and then, I mean, he's just going away at it. So that to me was probably, I mean, every death in the book took me by surprise, but that was the one that just totally blew my mind.
Did anybody else kind of hear that Alfred Hitchcock theme, like that psycho theme? Yeah, when he was doing that.
I mean, reminded me of. I was like, how did Hitchcock not do a version of this?
I mean, yeah, I think maybe I was one of the only ones that really expected Basil's death, and I expected so much more from the story along those veins, and a bit like more explicit than what we got. So I'd love to know, anyone in the comments, did anybody else actually expect Basil's death? I mean, it was kind of, to me, it was really obvious the moment I expected there to be a more conscious choice that Dorian makes, like a bargain with the devil. I mean, yes, that is another thing I was a bit surprised about, was that the whole thing really came about through a wish. I'd always heard it was like, with reviews, it's like making a deal with the devil and that kind of thing. But going back to Basil, it was so obvious to me. Like, as soon as Dorian was saying, well, you want to see my picture? We'll go ahead. Come and let's see it. So, yeah, it would be really interesting to hear from the comments if anybody else actually expected it to go the way it did with Basil.
I agreed with Miss Starbuck when she said, I thought Dorian would murder a lot more. Me too.
Yeah.
I was expecting it to be like a full rampage. And it did not end up being that at all. And the only part in the book that really at first made me go was Sybil. The way that Sybil died. I was not expecting that at all. And then everything after that, Basil's death, the opium dens, like everything, I was like, yeah, that's pretty much what I was expecting from this book at this point. And even like
you guys were like working towards like a Shakespeare like tragedy where everyone's dead at the end.
Pretty much, yeah. And I will say I agree. I agree with Jessica as well, that I thought that Henry was going to learn about Dorian. Like, I thought he was finally, because he kept talking about, well, Dorian will never be able to keep anything from me. He'll tell me everything. And then Dorian didn't. He didn't tell him that he murdered somebody. He didn't tell him all these heinous things. And Lord Henry's kind of like, oh, you can't be that bad. Look how pretty you are. And that was when I was like, Lord Henry doesn't know crap. He doesn't know anything. And I thought he was going to get to see Dorian's picture, and he didn't. And so I agreed. I was like, man, I did not expect Dorian to destroy his own painting.
And so also in the same veins of it. Sorry. I was going to say, also in the same veins of that, Henry was constantly asking Dorian to see the painting, or was constantly asking Dorian about the painting as well. And so the doors were there to follow down that route. It just didn't.
I expected Dorian to kill Henry too. I really did think he was going to kill everybody. Like, I was like, it's just everybody, just take the knife, everybody all around. And like, I thought he was kind of like going to skip town or something. Like, I didn't actually think by the end of the book that he would die, that Dorian would die. I thought it was going to be one of those things where we're kind of like left in mystery, that he's just off gallivanting around like a Jack the Ripper figure in London. And so, yeah, I was actually quite pleased with the ending overall. It was very sudden, like, for the way that it led up in the book, and suddenly it's like, oh yeah, he's dead on the floor after having stabbed his own painting. That was a little like abrupt, but I liked it. And Barker is agreeing, so sorry, he'll probably start barking soon.
I think the only other thing that made me go, actually, it's the only thing that made me go, oh my gosh, was the one line about Alan's death. That's the only thing that made me go, what? Because there was nothing kind of suggesting it leading up to it. I mean, yes, there was like that blackmail and stuff like that. But there was nothing leading up to what Alan was actually going to do.
Yeah, that's true. And Miss Starbuck does have a good point, saying, well, eventually he told, but he didn't believe it. Like, Henry didn't believe Dorian. And you have a fair point there. And yeah, Alan, I actually thought that was a really anticlimactic part of the book. I was kind of hoping Dorian was going to get murdered. I thought that was going to be interesting, which makes me sound very morbid, I realize.
Yeah, no, I'm in this. I completely agree.
Yeah, I was like, oh, this is going to be cool. And no, that didn't happen that way at all.
Like, Friday the 13th meets Shakespeare.
Yes.
No wonder you didn't think it was very horror.
It just tells you, I think, a lot about what I read. That probably says way more about me than it does about the book, personally, which is okay. But the
only reason I had a lower expectation of death just is because of the time period.
That's
So, but my experience of reading it was much similar to what Heather put, which it was like, okay, he's going to get the knife, but he's not actually going to kill him. Then it's like, oh, he's actually getting the knife. Well, he has the knife, but oh my gosh. I mean, I literally was like shaking, like, I can't believe. And then when it kept going on, I was like, oh, he's still stabbing him in this book. I also watch no horror, so.
That's fair.
Stabby.
Yeah, stabby.
I'm probably closer in sentiment to the Victorians. I'm like,
no, that's totally fair. And I do think that I probably am not giving the book its fair shake, because if I had read this at the time it was written, I imagine I would have had that response to it versus reading it now. And I do think that there's something to be said. One for you, one for you. Everybody gets a stab.
Yeah.
You get a stab. You get a stab. Oh
yeah, the next one I have, and I'm very curious. We have a panel full of ladies here. What did you think about Wilde's view of women in the book? And are there any strong female characters at all?
I think Sybil tried to be a strong female character. You know, with her acting and then her choice of being like, oh no, now that I'm in love, I don't need to be a good actor or anything like that. I think she tried to be a strong female character, but I think overall it was very male orientated. And any female characters that he wrote were very one-dimensional. Mm-hmm. So no.
One thing I thought was actually very interesting in that regard, because like obviously all the female characters are one-dimensional, terrible view of women, yada yada, but it was very interesting because despite that, women were not sexually objectified in the book at all. And I think it was very interesting to read a book that had such poor view of women, but also that complete lack of objectification in that regard. I mean, because he's a gay man.
Right.
But it was very interesting to read.
There was a lot of homoeroticism in the beginning. I did notice that. I was like, oh yeah, maybe that's part of why it was shocking in the beginning, is like how fond the men are like of each other, and like they're grabbing onto one another and holding each other's hands, and they're like going out to the garden. And I was like, oh, had I not known that Wilde was a gay man when he wrote the book, I probably would have been like, oh, is that just normal for the time? But I recognize that that was like kind of a hint, if you will, a little bit of a hint.
Yeah, and I think on Storygraph, a couple of us wrote about like that beginning where Basil was first introduced to Dorian, that a couple of us wondered whether it was a situation that actually happened to Wilde, because he was so, like, it was so well described that you actually really felt like you were there.
Yeah, and I think some of the way things were described, especially at the beginning between men, is somewhat of the time period. Like, men were definitely a lot more like chummy with one another in general, and you'll see that in books. Like, men will do things in Victorian novels together that you wouldn't see some men do today. But certainly not to the level. Like, I thought the beginning of the book was oddly lacking women, and very, very strongly male in a very different way. Because, I mean, very typically households in that time period would have been made up of women. You know, you would have had a lot of maids, you would have had a lot of, I mean, clearly you would have, his personal servant would have always been a butler or a manservant of something of that time. But, you know, there's a housekeeper there, and Dorian has one, but she's still kind of this like not really fleshed out character. I think the closest you have to a strong woman is it Lady Dorothea? Was that what her name was? Henry's cousin. Yeah. She was an interesting character, and I thought she was sort of a surprisingly interesting woman, given all the super negative thoughts that there were about women otherwise. Yeah.
I was bummed out there wasn't more of her. I also thought she was interesting. So
yeah, and Zach's saying the same thing. Yeah, same gender friends were physically more affectionate back then.
I think that's
Yeah.
nice, though. That's nice
Yeah.
that it wasn't viewed as being weird. It's too bad life isn't like that now. But yeah, I didn't like the way that women were portrayed in this at all, and like Lord Henry's disdain for married life, and how like he constantly talks about all the women that he woos, and that like he's in a very loveless marriage because his wife goes and finds people that she falls for as well, except none of hers are reciprocated. And so I just that was probably another huge contributing factor of why I just didn't think that this was a great story. And it probably never could be a great story to me. Like it could never have been a 5-star with how like looked down upon women were. But you know, I maybe that's just the trade-off for the time. Like people can shrug their shoulders and say like that's just how it was back then, but that doesn't mean we have to like it. And I don't like it.
I mean, I wonder though, like, without having read background information, like how much of those thoughts were Oscar Wilde's thoughts versus how much they were the thoughts of the characters. Because you are in a time period where men will be rakes, right? Like the entire society had a different opinion of women. But then Henry and then eventually Dorian are portrayed in the books. I mean, I think somebody in the comments started calling him Dorian Rake, which is like a type of guy who is a womanizer.
Is that what that means? I don't know what that means. So
I was about to ask, what does it actually mean?
That would be the modern day term. Is like a womanizer, a guy who's just like going around and just, you know, that's the best modern day equivalent that I can think of. And that so you do have to ask, would you expect a character who is a womanizer to say good things about women? And my thought would be no. Yes, there you go. That's probably the most up-to-date term.
Player.
And then that's a good term from the 90s, Alex. I'm with you on that one.
A player.
Yeah. Or a baller.
A baller.
There's all sorts of ways, but in the time period, it'd be a rake, like somebody who's going to go off and deflower your daughter. Like,
ooh. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Good to know. Which he did do that to people. I mean, it was implied in the book that he like took these women who were very good in society and turned them to be like scandalous.
Which is how he could be like, oh, well, I didn't bother that one girl in the village.
Yes. Oh, I hated that. He's like, see how good of a person I am that I didn't ruin her completely. Yeah, you terrible.
Congratulations, Dorian. I think there's been a couple of comments about a kind of retelling or reimagining in today's time, and I think that would be really interesting. Like, would things be different as far as female representation, and how would that affect, you know, how Dorian goes about doing things? I think a modern day retelling or reimagining of Dorian Gray is sorely needed.
I agree. I wonder why it hasn't been brought more to today. Like, because I think that they're like, look at the way that they did Romeo and Juliet with
Leonardo DiCaprio.
Yes, thank you, Leonardo DiCaprio, and I had him speak like in the actual Shakespeare lines, but in like modern times. I mean, this could easily be adapted into something like, but maybe it's, I don't know. People were saying, oh, there's the 2009 movie. We've had remakes of things way sooner than 15 years down the line, so maybe we're due for another one.
Kay, I do actually have something in the works. Don't know if it'll ever get published, but I do actually have something in the works. Kay's comment is anyone writing it? Any takers?
Okay.
So this book has inspired me to kind of take some of those core elements and see how it would work in modern life.
So there is one book that I know of, and it does not remake the entire story of Dorian Gray, But if you have the Unlikely Escape of Uriah Heep, is a fantasy novel by H.G. Perry. It is such a good book in and of its own right.
Gotta write that down.
It takes a whole bunch of characters that are in Victorian novels. Heathcliff is in there for you, Alex.
Okay.
And there is Dorian's in there. But it takes all these characters and it puts them in this fantasy world. And I won't say what Dorian is like in the book, but the basic premise of what is happening is these characters are coming to life based on this guy's own imagination, but they're coming to life with a twist. And so Dorian has a twist on him that brings him into the modern age, which I think is hilarious. Like, the whole book is hilarious and amazing and crazy. But yeah, if you go and read it, you will very much appreciate Dorian Gray in there at this point.
Thank you for that recommendation, Nicole.
Yeah,
And I know you were talking to other Alex about I can't do this. Other way, there we go. Down. This way. Yes. About Wuthering Heights. I know that Heathcliff is in that, but I have yet to read it. And Alex's feeling about it did not encourage me to want to read it very much. This book is making me, reading this, because this was supposed to introduce me back to classics. I'm like, what am I going to read next as a classic? Because I don't know what to pick up now. And it not Wuthering Heights, apparently. No. Okay, good to know.
No. And I did say when I reviewed this book this past weekend that this was not a book that I would recommend for people who are trying to get back into classics or are starting classics for the first time, unless you really like philosophy.
I do like philosophy. I just didn't like the way it handles in here. I love philosophy. Philosophy's fun.
It was a very here we go.
Philosophical.
Thank you, book. I put that link for the Unlikely Escape of Uriah Heep, like the Goodreads. Can people just let me know if that's actually clickable?
I can't check it because I can show the comment. So if anybody else can click on it,
yeah, it would have to be somebody in the comments because I can't click on it either, being backstage here. But you know what I mean.
And Kay, I'm very happy for you that you love Dorian Gray. I'm happy for everybody who loved this book. Right? Truly, I am. I'm always happy for people when they end up enjoying a book, even if I thought it was just meh. So
yeah, and Kay, let us know, because I think you were, of the people who were on when we asked the question, I think you're the only one who gave it complete 5 stars. So do put in the comments like what it is that made it a 5-star read for you, because I definitely would like to know, because there are definitely, like, I do see the potential in this book. Like, I think it takes people who like certain things in writing. And I think that's mainly from what I can see. I think what would either make or break the book for people would be the writing.
I completely agree with that. And I actually only have one other question, unless you all end up having any extras as well. And that is simply, is there any redemption for Dorian at the end of this book? Does he get a redemption in your eyes?
That's a bit of a sticky question.
A redemption arc. But I do think there are, like, redemption is a strong word. I don't think he's like pure evil or anything. I think he's a guilty man with a heavy conscience. Not for everything, but I think he does have a conscience, and I do think he has regret.
Okay.
But he doesn't atone or anything.
Okay. So no atonement, but you think he at least feels bad. So that's something. A little. He feels at least a little bit bad about
some things.
Okay. Okay. Jessica, Nicole?
Yeah, I don't know that Dorian is supposed to be redeemed or redeemable the way he is written. I think you're supposed to feel somewhat satisfied at how things end for him. And I think it's supposed to feel like maybe that he didn't exactly get justice, right, within the book in terms of in relation to other people, but that you are supposed to end on a serves him right, like kind of feel. So, yeah.
Jessica?
Maybe unpopular opinion, but I really hated the ending. I just thought it was a bit lackluster with Dorian kind of going up to his picture and like making this kind of stab, and then all of a sudden it's over. I was expecting more of a fight, and I wanted there to be more of a fight. So I really did not like the ending of that. I think there's always the potential for redemption with Dorian as well. Like I said, he had for quite a while, he had the angel and the devil, and then, for lack of a better term, he murdered the angel. Oh, perfect, Miss Virtue. Perfect. So for a while there was that redemption, and you could, for me, I could see him fighting with his conscience to just like try and be good at certain points of the movie and try to improve himself. So the potential was there. I just don't think it was well executed.
I think that those are all fair comments, and I do agree that he got his just desserts in the end. I don't think that he had to suffer for all of the horrible things that he did, though. Like it wasn't a slow creep to his eventual demise. It was actually an accident, like a total accident that he ended up dying. And for that, I don't think that he didn't have to deal with things for a really long time the way that other people whose lives he ruined did. And I don't think that that's necessarily fair in terms of, justice. I definitely don't think that he had any sort of redemption personally, but I also didn't like him as a person. So, that probably had a lot to do with it. And Kay asked an interesting question. Did the painting truly age, or was Dorian seeing it age in his mind hallucination?
I wrote something on Storygraph about this. Yeah, that was really the only thing that disproves the hallucination part of that is the fact that Basil did actually see it. But if Basil hadn't actually seen it, this whole thing, I would say it's been a hallucination, and like he's seeing the changes in his mind, because when he dies and his servant finds the painting is perfect. And so that kind of sent me down that rabbit hole when that happened. And then I thought, oh wait, hang on, Basil did actually see the painting and was horrified.
Yeah, I wish that Basil hadn't seen the painting, because then it would have left it a lot more questionable. I wish Basil had have gotten up to the point where he was about to see it, but then for some reason didn't, maybe because Dorian stabbed him too quickly. Because I wanted there to be that tension. I wanted you to be able to wonder, like, because I agree, Jessica. I think there were things at the end, the fact that it was, restored to normal did give you that moment of going, wait, was it ever changed? But because you have that moment where Basil saw it, it kind of makes it hard to extend that idea.
Yeah,
But
and
that's
the fact that
possibility.
his servants as well at the end, like, had to look at him and be like, "Who is this man?" Like, they had to look at his rings to be able to identify that it was Dorian, I think confirmed that it was a supernatural thing, but it to go along, Heather actually was asking the question, "How would you have ended it then?" I think that that idea I didn't even think about the idea of a hallucination. I really didn't. The entire time I took it as, like, it was just a supernatural, curse. And so I like that way more, this idea that it was a hallucination and that this whole time he actually was hideous and he just maybe didn't know. I don't know. That would have been way cooler.
But Miss Starbuck does bring up a good point, though, that he also would have had to deal with the fact that other people saw that he wasn't aging.
Right.
So there would have also have had to been some way of explaining that. Like,
Mhm.
yeah, I guess he would have had to recon the whole book. So
Yeah, it would have been a totally different story at that point
yeah.
for
Either
sure.
that or he just has the best genetics in the entire world. I mean, I'm don't listen to this too carefully, but I'm 33 this year and people still think I'm a teenager when they see me. I still get carded if I ever go into a liquor store, which is really embarrassing. But I think genetics has a huge play in that as well.
Mhm. Yeah. Oh, this was when we were talking about Heather's comment she was saying the same thing that I would have been that I did, that it would have been better to have not had Basil see it so that we could have had more
That makes
wondering of
perfect
things
sense.
in there.
I do like your all's like idea about that. I didn't necessarily think about how I would have changed the core element of the book, more so probably just the ending. So I think that's cool. I like that you thought about that. But yeah, I actually don't have any other questions either. So if you all want, you can kind of just give your final thoughts, and I think that'll be the end of our live show. So any final thoughts about this or classics in general? Because I'm probably going to talk about classics in general.
Oh no. Okay.
No, not in a bad way, Nicole. I promise.
Oh, good. So I'll share. I think my final thought on this is that, and this is kind of a thought on classics in general, is that I feel like sometimes when people explain classics, they will tend to describe them based on the climax of the book or even some of the falling action. And I feel like that's the case of what you hear about Dorian Gray. I feel like my feelings and thoughts about this book would be very different if somebody had described it to me as a somewhat like philosophical psychological character study. I would have gone into, that, explores like hedonism in 18th century Britain. I would have come to it in a very different mindset. But like, I had somebody tell me it was a Gothic novel, and I've read Gothic novels. This is not a Gothic novel.
It isn't.
Like, there are some Gothic elements to it, and there's definitely horror in it. But yeah. So I think it needs to be described to people better for people to, otherwise you're spending half the book being like, one, where's Dorian? And like, why is he so little in this book that's about him? And then two, you're like waiting to get creeped out and it's not happening.
Alex?
This was an interesting classic because as much as I didn't like it, I could see why people would. It was one where like it fell flat for me because I couldn't get into his writing or his character development, and it just like didn't work. But I liked so many of his ideas and like what he was trying to discuss and his commentary on society, and it was like I really wanted to get more into that than I really could, which I don't know, maybe Wilde just isn't for me.
So my first thought is this book is actually quite badly
You got it.
Misrepresented.
Yes, you got it.
It's still too early in the morning. It's just gone 8 o'clock.
You poor thing.
It's really badly misrepresented. Like, it even says on the back of mine, a young man who sells his soul for eternal youth and beauty.
Mhm.
But
He doesn't.
that's not really what happens. He makes a wish,
Mhm.
and then it happens. There is no, like, I was expecting through that first few chapters to go, okay, come on, where's the deal? You know?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Like, where's Satan coming into this? Who's going to be the dark angel?
Yeah, exactly. I'm like, come on, let's show me all of that, because that's what I got myself into, and I was quite disappointed knowing that's not what happened. And I agree with some of these comments where it's actually really hard to explain this book, but I think we need to stop saying that he sells his soul or he makes a deal with the devil, because that's not what happens.
Mhm.
So I think we kind of need to change the narrative a bit. As far as writing, I thought it was really bad, but like I said in the beginning, as far as character development, well, Dorian's character development and the layers that are intertwined within the book, I thought were really fantastic. So yeah,
excellent. Those were excellent final thoughts, and I agree with all of you, which is why I'm just going to talk about classics in general, because this was not, I think, the way for me to dive back into classics after so long of not having read one. The reason that Dorian Gray seemed like such a great choice is, one, it's short. It's a pretty short classic. Like, overall, it really doesn't take a whole heck of a lot to read, compared to some. And I didn't think that there was like a huge language barrier. Like, usually when I think of classics, I think of like language that my brain doesn't mesh with, because it's just not the way that people talk anymore. And there was that in this book, but I didn't think it was atrocious. So I am struggling with, if I didn't like this and this was an easy choice, what do I try to read next going into it where I feel like I'm going to have a better experience? And I don't know what that book is right now.
I would first start off by saying I don't think this is actually an easy choice.
You don't?
No.
Oh.
I think it's just a short choice.
Okay. Maybe that's why I thought it was easy. It's just because it was short.
Yeah.
Yeah,
and they
it
can
certainly
write a
wasn't
lot,
easy.
So if anybody has any recommendations at any point, doesn't have to be right now, but you can just let me know of what I should try to read next. Other than Jane Austen. I have Jane Austen.
Actually, I was going to ask for anyone who does read classics in the comments, but I was going to ask you, Nicole, because you said there were, like, it's labeled as being a Gothic novel, but it's not actually a Gothic novel.
Right.
There are some elements. So could you recommend, do you have any that you could recommend that are Gothic novels that are probably more well written?
Yeah, I mean, there's the classic Frankenstein.
Okay.
Though that also, like, if you have seen the movies, like, erase that from your mind. Like, there are elements in the movies that are like that, but I would also say that Mary Shelley's writing, especially at the beginning of the novel, can be a little bit harder to get into. But I honestly think the hardest part of getting into Frankenstein is we have an idea in our mind from the movies what that story is. But that's another book that is short. It is much more plot-based, I would say, surprisingly deeper than you think it's going to be. But you do kind of have to follow the stories because there's embedded narratives in it. So there's like a story within the story within the story. But that's a good one because a lot of people find it shorter and a bit more plot driven. And in terms of being Gothic, like that will have more classic, because Gothic novels are very atmospheric. So there's like weird atmosphere. There's weird things kind of going on in the book. You think there's a lot of supernatural elements. That's probably one that I would recommend. Like there are other really good Gothic novels, but quite a few of them are longer. And so some like Jane Eyre has a very Gothic feel to it, but I would say that's much longer and may not be a great choice for someone's first book.
I read Frankenstein back in high school. It's been a really long time since I've read Frankenstein.
Yeah.
So another question is, I saw a comment about Dickens, which I haven't read Dickens either. And then I just saw a comment saying I really want to read Dracula, but I haven't done that one yet. I haven't read Dracula either, and I really want to watch it. I really want to read it. But the question is, because I always thought Dickens was Victorian. So what's the difference between Gothic and Victorian literature?
It's an overlap. I think because it can depend on the time period. Like Gothic started earlier, and then you get into the Victorian period, but there is heavy overlap. I would say Gothic is more or less so a genre within the Victorian period. So the Victorian novels are really referring to a time period where novels that were written during the reign of Queen Victoria. Whereas Gothic novels are a style of writing that fall within a time period that largely overlaps with Victorian writing in general.
Okay.
That's good to know. I didn't know that either.
Yeah. And Dickens is good, but some people are I mean, I love Dickens. My favorite book ever is by Charles Dickens, so I will say nothing bad about the man and his writing. But he likes a good long book, and he likes to use a lot of dialect. So that can throw people.
Well, I want to personally say thank you, ladies, for this wonderful discussion. This has been a fantastic time. Thank you for taking a whole month just to prepare for this, and for everybody in the comments too.
Thank you guys so much for coming.
Yeah, and did the read along. Like, this is so cool to have this many people who showed up to our first event like this. So thank you, everybody. You're all fabulous.
Yeah, and if you guys really want to read Frankenstein, this is way off, but in October, I'm planning on doing a Read Like Frankenstein read-along. Because if you read Frankenstein, and this is like the caveat that I give with Frankenstein, this is not a spoiler, is the doctor.
Right, Dr. Frankenstein.
Yeah.
Right.
And then Frankenstein's monster.
But we're going to read actually like the monster, and the monster, I'm warning you, is very well read.
Oh.
Yes, extremely well read. To start, I will be reading Frankenstein. And what's that?
I will definitely keep that in mind. I'm also doing a read along in October, but it has got nothing to do with Frankenstein. So I'll have to.
That sounds like a lot of fun, and I'm definitely going to keep that on the back burner as well. That way I don't end up picking that up before October. I will keep that in mind.
Yeah, definitely. I'm also kind of seeing the beginnings of a buddy read of Dracula in the comments.
Yeah, a lot of people are either already have a copy or wanting to read it. So
I have a copy of Dracula, and I haven't read it. And I'd be keen for a buddy read, but not in April. I have my Stephen King read along, and that is full to the brim. So not in April. If you guys Miss Virtue, if you guys want to do a buddy read, that's sweet. Just not in April, please.
Well, I'm gonna say thank you to everybody, and I hope you all have a fabulous rest of your weekend. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you for putting together the whole live show part of this for us, Alex, and it has been fun doing this with you, ladies. So
yes,
I enjoyed our conversation.
Yeah, me too. Now, everybody, take care.
So much.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.